Star Trek completely forgot about these 10 alternate timelines. For a franchise built on paradoxes, time loops, alternate realities, and chronon-laced headaches, Star Trek has created a staggering number of alternate timelines, many of which quietly vanished without explanation. Some were wiped from existence, others were technically restored, and a few were simply never referenced again despite their massive implications for the galaxy. Here are 10 alternate timelines Star Trek created, then completely forgot about, ranked not by importance, but by how shockingly abandoned they are. 1. The Enterprise C never returned timeline TNG, yesterday's Enterprise. Perhaps the most famous alternate reality of the franchise, the timeline where the Enterprise D becomes a full-time warship and Tasha Yar survives, is arguably too important to forget. The Federation is losing a decades-long war with the Klingons, Starfleet is militarized, and peace was never achieved. Yet once the Enterprise C returns through the rift, this timeline is erased, except for Tasha's return and Sella's existence. The show never revisits the massive ripple effects such a universe would have caused. This is practically the Kelvin timeline before the Kelvin timeline, and still, it vanished into temporal mist. 2. The Post-Borg Civilization Future TNG. Parallels. Worst dimensional hopping adventure briefly shows us dozens of alternate realities, but one is so huge that it deserves follow-up. Greater than an entire timeline where the Borg have conquered the Federation. We see Starfleet fleeing in fear, the galaxy in chaos, and a desperate Riker manning a doomed Enterprise. This is a terrifying reality, and one that Star Trek never mentions again, despite the Borg remaining major villains for decades. 3. The Enterprise J Timeline ENT, Azadi Prime. In Enterprise, Archer is taken forward 400 years to meet Captain Dax aboard the futuristic Enterprise J during the temporal Cold War. We glimpse a Federation millennium more powerful, fighting the Sphere Builders in the Battle of Procyon V, a pivotal moment in galactic history. But after Season 4 ended abruptly, the show never returned to this future. And later series Discovery, Picard, Lower Decks have never referenced it either. Enterprise J might still exist, or it might not, but Star Trek seems to have tossed it into a temporal recycling bin. 4. The Voyager Time Loop Future VOY, Timeless. In this alternate reality, Chakotay and Harry Kim inadvertently cause Voyager to crash into an ice planet, killing everyone aboard. Decades later, a guilt-ridden Harry sabotages Starfleet regulations to send a time message that fixes history. The result? The crashed timeline is wiped out. Fixed timeline, Harry remembers nothing. The Federation pretends none of this happened. The emotional trauma? Gone. The alternate future where Harry finally became the hero? Deleted from canon like a corrupted Starfleet file. 5. The Cardassian-ruled Alpha Quadrant DS9. Visionary. O'Brien briefly flashes into the future where the Klingon-Cardassian alliance destroys Deep Space Nine and defeats the Federation. This future is technically avoided when the Romulans are exposed, but the scope of events implies a massive alternate chain of history that should have left lingering consequences. Instead, the future dissolves and DS9 moves on like nothing happened. 6. The Vulcan-dominated timeline TOS. Yesteryear. In the animated series, Spock travels to the past and accidentally erases his younger self, causing history to shift. Spock dies in childhood. The Federation becomes more militarized. The Andorians thrive while Vulcan withdraws from galactic diplomacy. This is one of the earliest canon alternate timelines Star Trek ever produced, and it's never acknowledged again, even in later stories that explore Spock's childhood and Vulcan politics. 7. The Earth Empire Timeline Mirror Universe Divergence. The Mirror Universe is famously recurring, but one thing Star Trek never explores is the future created when the Empire falls and is replaced by the Alliance. We know the Empire collapsed after Kirk influences Spock, and later, humans become oppressed. The Terrans are enslaved. By DS9, the Federation equivalent barely exists. Yet Discovery returns to the Mirror Universe only to ignore centuries of lost lore and never explore the alternate future farther than the 23rd century. It's arguably the largest alternate timeline in Star Trek, and it's mostly abandoned. 8. The No-Con, No Starfleet Superweapons Timeline SNW. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Strange New Worlds reveals a timeline where Khan is never born. The eugenics wars happen differently. Canada becomes a hotbed of temporal interference. Lon's entire lineage is altered. This should have consequences for the Dominion War. Section 31. Admiral Marcus and Star Trek Into Darkness events. But after the episode ends, the timeline collapses and the show never revisits the biggest retcon to Trek history since time travel was invented. 9. The Borg Free Federation Timeline VOY. Relativity. Janeway's interference prevents a temporal explosion that would have erased Voyager long before encountering the Borg, or 7 of 9. This means an alternate future once existed where 7 of 9 never joined Starfleet. Voyager never encountered species 8472. Janeway never brings Borg tech home. Picard's Borg modernization arc arguably never happens. That's an entire quadrant of history rewritten, yet never explored or acknowledged again. 10. The Kelvin Timeline Star Trek 2009. Yes, it technically still exists, but let's be honest. The Kelvin Timeline is the biggest alternate timeline in franchise history. 3 films, altered Federation history, Vulcan destroyed, and entirely divergent starship culture. Yet following Star Trek Beyond, the franchise has returned almost exclusively to prime timeline stories, made no further cinematic follow-ups, never cross-referenced Kelvin events in Discovery, Picard, or Lower Decks. For something created as a flagship reboot universe, Star Trek seems to have quietly moved on. The timeline isn't erased, it's just culturally abandoned. Why Star Trek keeps creating dead-end timelines? 3 reasons. 1. Plot devices. Not canon commitments. Alternate histories provide dramatic stakes, but writers often treat them like temporary set dressing. 2. Franchise continuity is already overloaded. With 60 years of canon, adding more timelines risks collapsing the lore like a warp bubble paradox. 3. Alternate timelines undermine character arcs. If anything can be undone, emotional consequences lose weight, so writers reset the board. The future. Will Star Trek ever revisit these timelines? There are hints the franchise might circle back. Lower Decks loves meta-continuity. Strange New Worlds is actively rewriting timeline mechanics. Picard Season 2 already dealt with temporal divergence. A future series could absolutely explore the Borg-conquered galaxy, the Enterprise J's distant future, Tasha Yar's war-dominated reality, or even bring the Kelvin timeline back for a final cinematic conclusion. In Star Trek, no timeline is truly gone. Alternate universes don't disappear, they just wait for the right anomaly, wormhole, or Q intervention to pull them back. Until then, these 10 forgotten timelines remain scattered across subspace, erased but not forgotten, just like a chronoton particle drifting between realities. End transmission. With 60 years of canon, adding more timelines risks collapsing the lore like a warp bubble paradox. 3 alternate timelines undermine character arcs. If anything can be undone, emotional consequences lose weight, so writers reset the board. The future. Will Star Trek ever revisit these timelines? There are hints the franchise might circle back.